Hello and welcome. I'm Geeta Mohan and you're watching India Today Global. US President Donald Trump used a prime-time Oval Office address to attack former President Joe Biden while highlighting his administration's claims on border security, economic recovery and foreign policy achievements, including averting wars and announcing new payments for US military personnel. Mahashweta Lala with this report.
US President Donald Trump's fixation with Joe Biden is not over. As he addressed from the Oval Office, he began his 20-minute primetime speech by attacking former President Joe Biden and his economy.
Good evening, America. 11 months ago, I inherited a mess, and I'm fixing it. This is what the Biden administration allowed to happen to our country, and it can never be allowed to happen again.
The issue of drugs.
But then he went to praise the achievements under his presidentship. He spoke of how he has been successful in stopping the inflow of illegal aliens and in building the strongest border in the country.
Starting on day one, I took immediate action to stop the invasion of our southern border. For the past 7 months, 0 illegal aliens have been allowed into our country, a feat which everyone said was absolutely impossible. Do you remember when Joe Biden said that he needed Congress to pass legislation to help close the border? We inherited the worst border anywhere in the world, and we quickly turned it into the strongest border in the history of our country.
As Americans complain about affordability and inflation, the president said his government has been able to cut down the prices and reduce the cost of healthcare, enabling the United States to become most favored nation. But the speech was not all about the domestic achievements. It was also about foreign policies and war. Trump again reiterated his claim that he was able to avert 8 wars and bring in ceasefire.
I've restored American strength, settled 8 wars in 10 months, destroyed the Iran nuclear threat, and ended the war in Gaza, bringing for the first time in 3,000 years peace to the Middle East, and secured the release of the hostages, both living and dead. Here at home, we're bringing our economy back from the brink of ruin.
The president also announced that he would be issuing checks to members of the United States military of $1,776, calling the payment the warrior dividend. He credited tariffs for bringing in money to the nation. He was joined by White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, who during a recent interview to Vanity Fair said the president had an alcoholic personality. With Mahashweta Lala, Bureau Report, India Today.
There's a lot to unpack on this one. Joining me to discuss this and more is former American diplomat, Ambassador Daniel Fried from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Fried, thank you so much for joining me. You must have heard the entire address by President Trump, wherein he's talked about settling many wars, including the India-Pakistan one in just 10 months. But it also includes Gaza and the broader Middle East peace. But the Ukraine-Russia conflict resolution is still far from being achieved. What do you think President Trump's approach towards this conflict is, and how will it affect Russia and Eastern Europe broadly when it comes to America?
Excellent question. Much depends on whether Trump allows himself to be led around by Putin or whether Trump backs his own proposal and pushes Putin to accept it. And I can't answer that question. Right now, the U.S. plan could work. That is a ceasefire, and hopefully the U.S. will stop pressing Ukraine to give up additional territory, but a ceasefire plus security for Ukraine that is short of NATO membership and provisions for rebuilding Ukraine. This could work, and Trump could get much of the credit for it. But there seems to be no buy-in whatsoever from the Kremlin. The Kremlin seems to be insisting on its original maximum demands, which essentially would reduce Ukraine to a colonial subject or a satellite country of Russia. And it is only when and if the United States and Europe push back against Russia that Putin may change his mind. And I can't answer that question. Trump could settle the war and get the credit, or he could allow Putin to shape the terms and keep the war going.
Right. Ambassador Fried, the president boasted about rebuilding military and record enlistments, but he took some bold steps by pushing NATO members to commit bigger defense allocations. Given your time in Poland and your experience with NATO, how are his policies going to impact the US alliance, and what is your take about the future of NATO here?
Well, another good question. The answer depends on whether Trump will take the win. Trump has essentially won the argument with the Europeans. It's been going on for years or decades that Europe has to do more to provide for its own defense. Americans have been complaining about low European military budgets for 35 years, maybe more. And the Europeans finally have stepped up or started to step up, not because Trump pushes them, but because Russia now is an apparent threat that most of the Europeans, not all, agree on. If Trump lands this deal, which is basically the U.S. will continue to invest in the transatlantic alliance if Europe stands up and pulls its weight, that deal could be advantageous to everybody. The trouble is that there are some people in the Trump administration who just don't like NATO at all. They want to withdraw from Europe entirely, which would be a bad idea. Who prevails, I can't say. And this battle is going on within the administration and within the Republican Party.
Right.
So don't know the way it comes out, but there is every potential for a successful outcome at the other side of whatever you want to call what it is we're going through.
Okay. Okay, talking about bad ideas here, let's talk about his tariff policy and the fact that he's claiming bringing factories and jobs back home. As an expert, what worries you about this, especially for US partners and America's trade ties with countries like India?
Well, with specific respect to India, I think the imposition of additional tariffs on Indian products because India was buying oil from Russia was a terrible idea. India was buying oil from Russia because the US encouraged it to do so under the terms of the oil price cap. The idea was India would get to buy cheaper Russian oil, depriving Russia of revenue and earning India an economic benefit. Good idea all around. Trump turned on India and pressed them. That was a bad idea. More generally, Trump's tariffs seem to be inconsistently applied and erratically applied. And because of the inconsistencies, it's harder for companies to make the decision to invest in the United States. To invest in the United States, to invest anywhere, companies need certainty. They need predictability. Trump is anything but predictable. Moreover, investing in the United States requires sometimes bringing in outside experts to the United States who are familiar with the industrial technology needed. Trump administration has made that complicated. It may require importing parts to make the factories run right. Trump administration has made that more difficult by its tariff policies. So you can make an argument for tariffs, and you can make criticisms of the free trade economic orthodoxy. But to do so, you have to replace it with something that is consistent and predictable and stable to earn the potential benefits, and the Trump administration has not yet done that.
Ambassador, you're saying that the tariff policies are terrible, but are they really going to impact Indo-US strategic ties? And are we looking at the two countries really coming up and signing a bilateral trade agreement sooner than later?
Well, I'm not privy to the details of US-India discussions. It is entirely possible that the Trump administration will find a way to back out of its excessive and unproductive pressure on India. It is backed out in similar cases before. So this is possible, and I hope that India keeps working with the United States. There is a way through all this. The United States has sometimes had complaints about access to foreign markets and restrictions. And the U.S., I'm not an expert in U.S.-India trade relations, but if the U.S. had problems, with some of India's policies, the U.S. and India can and should work this out. I hope that they do. Generations of U.S. policymakers since the Clinton administration have sought to build ties with India because it's good for both countries, good for U.S. strategy. This was Democrats and Republicans alike. The strategy remains sound for both countries, and I hope we find our way back to it.
There are so many layers when it comes to India and the United States of America. Migration is another layer and another important pillar of President Trump's policy. The U.S. has benefited a lot from global talent, including professionals from India. How sustainable do you think this approach is, and what's your take on balancing legal immigration benefits within the U.S. constitutional framework?
I like the way you put that question, because immigration has been of enormous benefit to the United States. And unlike most European countries, the United States finds it much easier to bring in new immigrants who become American. Being American is not a matter of ethnicity. It's not a matter of blood. It's a matter of belief. We are a credo nation. That's what Abraham Lincoln pointed out. It is an enormous benefit. And talented Indians have been of enormous benefit to the United States. There's no question about that. It is perfectly fair for the Trump administration to try to stop illegal immigration. Perfectly reasonable. But this shouldn't mean that we make legal immigration difficult or indulge in, frankly, nativist and racist pressure on frankly, non-white immigrants for no good reason. That pressure is one of our worst American traditions. It's our dark side. And we need to get rid of it, not let it crawl its way back. There's a way forward that is tough on illegal immigration, welcoming for legal immigrants, and I hope the Trump administration finds its way through this, but the evidence is not all there yet.
Right. Daniel Fried, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. The United States has unleashed an unprecedented surge of airstrikes in Somalia since Donald Trump's return to office, hitting militant groups at record levels while loosening oversight and drawing concern over civilian deaths. With the campaign intensifying and questions mounting over its human cost, is Washington defeating terrorism or fueling a deeper cycle of violence? Srijita Sen-Mozumdar with this report.
The United States has dramatically ramped up its military operations in Somalia, and the numbers are staggering. Since President Donald Trump returned to office, the US has conducted 111 airstrikes against armed groups in the conflict-ridden East African nation. To put this in perspective, that's more strikes than the Bush, Obama, and Biden administrations combined. The escalation began in February with Trump's first strike of his second term. Just months later, a senior US Navy admiral claimed the military had carried out what he called the largest airstrike in the history of the world from an aircraft carrier. That's a dramatic shift from how previous administrations handled operations in Somalia. The most recent strike happened on December 14, about 50 kilometers northeast of Kismayo, targeting members of Al-Shabaab, the Somali armed group that's been fighting the government since 2007. So, who's being targeted? Primarily, two groups. First, Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda affiliate that controls large areas of south-central Somalia. And second, ISIS in Somalia, a smaller group with around 1,500 fighters concentrated in the northeast. This intensified campaign is happening because War Secretary Pete Hegseth reversed Biden-era restrictions that required White House approval for strikes outside war zones. Now, AFRICOM commanders have much greater authority to launch attacks on their own. More than half of these strikes have supported Somalia's autonomous Puntland region in its fight against ISIS Somalia. The remaining operations focus on Al-Shabaab's advances in the south, where Somali government forces have faced serious setbacks this year. One massive operation in February saw 16 fighter jets launched from the USS Harry S. Truman, dropping 60 tons of munitions on Kyiv complexes in the Golis Mountains. That strike alone killed 14 people. However, the intensified operations have raised significant concerns regarding civilian casualties. According to investigative reports, US airstrikes and Somali forces resulted in the death of at least 11 civilians, including 7 children, during a November operation. While the US military has confirmed conducting these strikes, officials have declined to address the reported civilian deaths. More troubling still, the military has recently discontinued the practice of providing civilian casualty assessments in its operational announcements. Somalia's war with armed groups killed over 7,000 people last year, making it Africa's third deadliest conflict. Adding to the controversy, Trump recently launched verbal attacks on Somali immigrants in Minnesota as federal authorities prepared a major immigration crackdown targeting hundreds of undocumented Somalis. His comments have been denounced from Mogadishu to Minneapolis. With the strike total potentially exceeding Trump's first-term record of 219 operations and civilian casualties mounting, this aggressive military strategy raises critical questions. Is this escalation effectively combating terrorism, or is it creating new cycles of violence? As the pace of operations shows no signs of slowing, the impact on Somalia's already devastated population remains the untold story of America's expanding shadow war in East Africa. With Shijita Sen Mojumdar, Bureau Report, IndiaToday Global.
As Ukraine and the European leaders gather in Brussels to approve a loan to keep Ukraine afloat in the new year, Putin has warned that Russia would pursue military means if peace talks fail, blaming the West for the war. Mahashweta Lala with this report.
As European leaders, the United States and Ukrainian leadership hold talks to reach to a conclusion to end the Russia-Ukraine crisis, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned that Moscow would liberate its historical lands if talks fail.
The goals of the special military operation will undoubtedly be achieved. We would prefer to do so and eliminate the root cause of the conflict through diplomacy. If the opposing side and its foreign patrons refuse to engage in substantive dialogue, Russia will achieve the liberation of its historical lands by military means. The task of creating and expanding a security buffer zone will also be pursued consistently.
Putin was speaking during an annual meeting with top military officers. He said the Russian Federation was not the one which started the 2022 war. In fact, once again, he squarely blamed the West for unleashing the war. He said that Russia was only insisting on the promise of not 1 inch eastward, an assurance given by Western leaders to erstwhile Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev during the talks of German unification in 1990.
Возможно, что и так. Готовы вести переговоры и готовы решать все.
It was not us who started the war in 2022. It was destructive forces in Ukraine, supported by the West. It was basically the West themselves who unleashed this war. We are only trying to end it.
Такую готовность мы ведем с ними диалог. Надеюсь, то же самое произойдет.
Following the warning, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said the speech signals that 2026 will be year of war.
Today we again heard signals from Moscow that they are preparing to make next year a year of war. And these signals are not only for us. It is crucial that our partners see them, and not only see them, but also respond, especially partners in the United States, who often say that Russia wants to end the war.
Meanwhile, leaders from European Union's 27 member states gathered in Brussels for a high-stakes summit aimed at funding Ukraine's war effort and reconstruction for the next 2 years. However, President Putin lauded Donald Trump's efforts to bring peace in the region. He reiterated his call for dialogue not only with the United States but also with Europe, but expressed skepticism of a dialogue with the current European political elites.
Это не мы в 2022 году.
We are ready to hold talks and resolve all the issues that have come up in the recent years by peaceful means. The US administration is showing such readiness, and we are conducting dialogue with them. I hope the same will happen with Europe. It is unlikely that this will be possible with the current political elites. But in any case, it will become inevitable as we continue to strengthen. If not with the current politicians, then with the change of political elites in Europe.
Потому что поняли, что нас обманывают.
Last few weeks have been very crucial in deciding the fate of the war. After 5 hours of marathon meeting between Putin and Trump's special envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in Moscow, followed by Zelensky meeting the US special envoy in Berlin, European leaders have huddled together to decide the fate of Ukraine and Europe. A draft has also been submitted by Ukraine listing their demands and opposing any territorial concessions. Europe too has stated that anything that has to do with Europe and Ukraine must be decided by them. With Mahashweta Lala, Bureau Report, India Today.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has filed a legal complaint against Nobel Foundation seeking to halt payments to Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Assange had said Machado's public support for US President Donald Trump's military actions against Venezuela is contrary to the core principles of the Peace Prize. In a statement shared by WikiLeaks on X, the organization said Assange is attempting to prevent the Nobel Foundation from releasing more than $1 million that Machado is set to receive as part of the award. Assange pointed to Machado's remarks in a recent television interview as evidence that she does not meet that standard. And here are some other stories from across the world in World at a Glance. So with that, it's a wrap on this edition of India Today Global. Goodbye and take care.
Sex offender Jeffrey Epstein's accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, has filed fresh petitions with the federal court in Manhattan that she did not receive a fair trial. Failing at all attempts to get relief, Maxwell has used an unusual legal mechanism known as habeas petition, which seeks extraordinary relief from the court. The submissions were filed pro se, meaning that they were filed by Maxwell herself rather than by her attorneys. Meanwhile, the Justice Department is required to release investigative documents related to Jeffrey Epstein by tomorrow. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will introduce wide-ranging reforms to crack down on hate speech following the country's worst mass shooting in nearly 3 decades at a Jewish holiday event. The alleged father and son gunmen opened fire as hundreds of people celebrated Hanukkah on Sydney's famous Bondi Beach. Amid tensions along the Thailand-Cambodia border, China has offered to mediate between the two warring neighbors after a ceasefire brokered by US President Donald Trump failed to hold. Fresh skirmishes erupted in December with artillery exchanges, airstrikes and ground operations along disputed border areas, leading to the displacement of thousands of civilians.